All right, so I'm going to talk about another theological problem that people get wrong. And I'm going to try to be patient about it. And I realize it's kind of contentious, but it really shouldn't be, because the truth is a lot more peaceful than I think people really give it credit for. It all comes back to the issue that I keep seeing is, what source do people ascribe um, holiness to? What I mean by that is, if I obey God, what's the reason that I obey God? What's the ultimate reason, the ultimate source? Somebody might say, well, your love for God. Okay. Now, where does the love for God come from? They say it comes from your heart. Well, that's not the source. God is the source. God gives people love for Him. Your heart is not the source. The source is the beginning of it. The source is God. God gives people love for Him. And the problem is, people say things like, God helps those that help themselves, or ask Jesus into your heart, and things like that. The problem, now, this is just the way that I see it and the way that I hear it. And the reason for that is because of my background. My background in free will baptism, where you don't know if you're saved or not. You have I don't even know how to get into it. The responsibility for salvation is it's not a responsibility. Salvation is not a responsibility. It's a gift. It's a gift. And the problem is, people just run their mouths about this ignorantly. And when they do that, they hurt a lot of people. They hurt a lot of people. Let's how can I put it? Salvation is a gift. When I first read Michael Horton, Putting Amazing Back into Grace, I really encourage you to read that book. The will is created by God. Now, listen, it gets complicated because there's a lot of theologians that'll talk about free will. Okay, and it gets really deep, and it's probably a somewhat fair accusation to say, Cody, you're getting lost in the weeds. You're missing the forest for the trees. Why don't you focus more on love and loving your neighbor and all this, instead of this one particular branch that you keep focusing on? Well, because to me, it's the branch that holds me. It's the branch that converted me. It's the branch that makes sense to me. It's the branch that alleviated a lot of stress. I mean, listen, some of y'all know me. I'm a stressed out person, but do you know how stressed out I was before I realized that God gets the glory for good works? If you're the one who's responsible for your own salvation, you're never going to be satisfied. So when God reveals to you that He's the one responsible for salvation, that He's the one who does it all, He's the one who chooses, He's the one who picks, He's the one who elects, He's the one who conforms, He's the one who had Christ live according to the law perfectly. Once you ascribe to him all about all that salvation is, you're actually getting to the truth of the gospel, that you're actually getting there. The burden is no longer on your shoulders to be saved, because salvation is a gift. And once again, people will say, Cody, but you have to receive the gift. You have to receive the gift. Often I heard that when I was a kid. I'm not going to get too into it, because I'll get real mad if I do. I'll get real mad if I go back that far. Okay. I'm serious. I'll explode if I go that far. I don't want to go back that far. But the problem is, if we say things that aren't true, we end up hurting a lot of people when it comes to God. We really do. I think that's part of the reason why God only calls. If God doesn't call you to preach, then you shouldn't preach. Even if you mean well, you really shouldn't preach unless you know that God has called you to preach, because if he hasn't called you to preach, you're not going to produce any fruit. You're not going to produce any fruit unless God is the one who calls you to preach. And then if God calls you to preach, then God produces the fruit through the preaching that he gives you. So I just wanted to, I don't want to get in too deep about it, but the point is, God is the one who gets the glory for all of it. He's the one who gets the glory for salvation. Viewing salvation as a responsibility kind of misses what salvation is. I think the reason people do that is because you want people to be saved. You really do. You really want people to be saved. And then you try to will people to be saved. You try to scream people into salvation. You try to really will people into salvation with your own will. But the Bible says it's not of him that willeth. It's not of him that willeth. It's of God that showeth mercy. It's all of God. God is the one who decides to show mercy on whom he will. So if you're preaching and someone hasn't been converted under that message, then you have to say, he will have mercy on whom he will have mercy. If I've obeyed God and I've preached what God's told me to preach, and someone still isn't saved, I've done the will that God has wanted me to do. And if it's his will that person not be converted under my preaching, then I have to say that's God's will. And I say, Lord, I wanted to be saved. But the point is, we have to ascribe the source appropriately. And the source is God. Too many people preach responsibility. The problem with that is it actually separates you from God. It really does. I think that's all I've got for right now. Just and it really shouldn't be a contentious topic. I realize it might be, and I realize it can go a lot of different directions. There can be a lot of questions that arise from it. And all I'm trying to say is, if the source of salvation is God, then that takes a burden off of you about how do you get saved? How do I get saved? Well, if God is the one who is the source, if he's the one who's the source, then your burden to be saved gets lifted. And that really is a small part of the beauty of salvation. It's a burden lifted. The responsibility to be saved is lifted, because God, once he saves you, you're saved. He lifts it off of you. He's the one who gets the glory for saving you. So the responsibility, the burden is off of you, and that's part of what salvation is. Part of what salvation is a lifting of that burden off of you. So once again, it can go a lot of different directions. So I hope my little branch of Christianity just kind of hopefully it makes something click for you, because it made a lot of stuff click for me personally whenever I first started. Shortly after I got called, I ran into this theology, and I thought, wow, that's completely different than everything I thought from the time I was 9 years old. I mean, for one little bit of theology just resolved 14 years of torment for me. So that's why I really focus on that branch, because of how much torment it lifted off of me.